So the square root property, the solution to the quadratic equation, let's say you have just x squared minus some value equals 0, okay? Well, for something like this, we could add c to both sides, and we would get x squared equals c. And now we can take the square root of both sides and say x is equal plus or minus the square root of c. So that's the square root property, okay? But notice there's no bx here. If you have that bx, you can't do this. So let's say we want to solve the quadratic equations. Well, here I can say x squared, and if I add 16 to both sides, I would get x squared equals 16. And now, if I want to solve it, I can take the square root of both sides. The square root and the square cancel, and I get x equals plus or minus the square root of 16, which is x equals plus or minus 4. And if you're looking for the factors, it would be x minus 4 times x plus 4, which hopefully some of you know as the difference of squares, okay? Because when I multiply them together, I get the difference of squares, okay? So let's see what happens here. We're going to subtract 72 from both sides. Subtract 72 from both sides. And I get 2x squared equals negative 72. I divide both sides by 2, and I get x squared equals negative 36, which gives me, if I take the square root of both sides, it gives me x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 36, okay? Now, that does not come out to be a real number. That comes out to be a complex number. So now, since we have plus or minus the square root of a negative number, well, that's not a real number. That's a complex number, which we won't be talking about in this class. So this would have no real solution. Okay, because there's no two numbers except a complex number where we multiply them, the same numbers together, and get a negative, right? And then the last problem here, well, I don't have to actually multiply that x minus 1 squared all the way out and then subtract 7 from both sides. Because that is squared, I can just say x minus 1, I can take the square root of both, here, let me do it like this. X minus 1 squared equals 7. If I take the square root of both sides, the square root and the square cancel, I get x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. And then I would add 1 to both sides. So I would have x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 7, which is the same as saying x equals 1 plus the square root of 7, or x equals 1 minus the square root of 7. So again, notice we have our two solutions, but we can also write it as plus or minus. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the quadratic formula, and this is something you really have to know. So whenever you have something that you can't factor, then the only other way, if it's a quadratic equation that you can't factor, the only other way to do to find the solution is to use the quadratic formula. And it is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. And we already talked about what a, b, and c are, okay? So for example, if I want to solve this, well, I can try to factor, but if I try to factor, it probably won't work, because I need two numbers that multiply together to give me -6, right? Because A equals 3 and B equals -2, and I'm sorry, +2, and C equals -2. So A times C is equal to -6, and B is equal to 2. And if I were to go make that table, or however you do it, sorry, m plus n. If I were to try to find the factors of -6, I would have 1 and 6, 2 and 3, and that's really it, because the next number will be 3 times 2, which I already have. And then if I make one side negative, it doesn't really matter to begin with which side I make negative. When I add them, sorry, it's m plus n. When I add them, this is 5 and 1. Notice neither one of them is equal to 2. So right away, I know that this cannot be factored. Okay, so I'm going to use the quadratic formula. Some of you may find that the quadratic formula is easier for you when you need to solve, and you're not just asked to factor, but you need to actually solve, that the quadratic formula will work for anything. And some of you might find it easier to just use the quadratic formula. So let's do it. We have, as long as this quadratic equals 0, so remember that has to happen. We have to have it in the form where it equals 0. And this one is, so now we have x equals -b, so -2 plus or minus the square root of b squared, here I'll write it all out, 2 squared minus 4 times a times c. This whole thing is divided by 2a, and a is 3. And then you can take out your calculator or whatever you want to do. I'm just going to do the work here, and I get 4. Now I have a negative, and then I have a -2, so this is going to be plus. And I have 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 2 is 24. Divided by 6, which equals -2 plus or minus the square root of 28 over 6. Okay, now we have to simplify that square root of 28, because really what we have is two solutions right now. We have -2 over 6. I can just separate that into two fractions, plus or minus the square root of 28 over 6. And we really need to simplify. So it's pretty easy to simplify -2/6, hopefully, is -1/3. But we still have plus or minus the square root of 28 over 6. So let me show you, if you know how to simplify the square root of 28, that's fine. If you don't, this will always work for you. So this is kind of how I usually teach it. And if you're really good at it, there's simpler ways to do it. But if you get stuck, so let's talk about the square root of 28. The long way, but the easy way, is I start with 28 and I make a factor tree. And my factor tree here is 2 times 14, right? Because I want two numbers that multiply together to give me 28. So 2 times 14. And 2 is a prime number, so I'm done with 2. But 14, I can still break down to 2 times 7. 2 is prime and 7 is prime. So now I know this is equal to the square root of 2 times 2 times 7. Okay? And then hopefully you know that if you have the square root of x squared, where you have to make sure that x is greater than 0, okay? Greater than or equal to 0. If this is true, then I can cancel those, and I just get the square root of x squared is equal to x. If x is less than if x is less than 0, I'm going to square it, so I'm going to make it positive. So it's going to be a positive number, but it won't be the original x. It will actually be the absolute value of x if x is less than 0. So whatever it is, like if it was, for example, the square root of -2 squared, well, I don't just cancel that. I say this is equal to the square root of -2 squared is -2 times -2, so that's 4. So that's equal to 2, which is the absolute value of my x. And that's what I mean by that. Having said all that, if I have the square root of 2 times 2 times 7, that's really the same as the square root of 2 squared times 7. And I could even change this into the square root of 2 squared times the square root of 7. So with multiplication, I can separate the roots, or I can put them back together. Only with multiplication and division. With addition and subtraction, this doesn't work for square roots. This equals, and I can cancel the square root with the 2. So I get 2 times the square root of 7. And that is simplified. That's as simple as I can make it, okay? Because the square root of 7, there's no way to simplify that. I can put it in my calculator and I can get a decimal value for it, but that's not what we're looking for, okay? So another way you can think about it, I don't want to confuse you too much, but if I have the square root of 2 times 2 times 7, what I can say is, okay, well, for every 2 I have under the radical, I get 1 outside. And so it still comes out to 2 times the square root of 7, but that's another way to think about it. Again, if any of this is confusing to you, please feel free to come to my office hours or go to the MLC and have them help you with factoring, okay? Let's go back to the last slide, and I'm going to say this is equal to -1/3 plus or minus. And we said the square root of 28 is 2 times the square root of 7. So it's 2 times the square root of 7 over 6. And again, I can simplify 2 and 6, and I get this equal -1/3 plus or minus the square root of 7 over 3. And again, you can put them back together, or you can keep them apart, but that would be the final answer. And if you're not sure exactly what the plus or minus means, here, let me write it here. So it means x equals -1/3, it's a negative, hold on, -1/3 plus the square root of 7 over 3, or x equals -1/3 minus the square root of 7 over 3. And that's basically what we'll be covering in 1.4 for this class. All right, thank you guys very much.